This is the story of what happened when a world-class fighter stepped into the octagon, won his paycheck, took his damage, and then found out the man who hit him was on drugs the whole time. Mark Hunt versus the UFC is one of the most controversial legal battles in combat sports history. A fighter, a failed drug test, a multi-million-dollar lawsuit, and a courtroom fight that lasted nearly 7 years. By the end of this video, you will understand exactly what happened, why it mattered, and why, despite everything, Mark Hunt walked away with nothing. Let's get into it. Before we talk about lawsuits and courtrooms, you need to understand who Mark Hunt is, because that context matters enormously for why this story hit the way it did. Mark Hunt is a heavyweight fighter from New Zealand, and for a long time, he was considered one of the most dangerous knockout artists on the planet. The man has hands like sledgehammers. He built his reputation not in MMA originally, but in kickboxing, specifically K1, which at its peak in the late 1990s and early 2000s was the premier striking competition in the world. In 2001, Hunt won the K1 World Grand Prix Championship. That is the equivalent of a world title in the most competitive striking tournament on earth. He transitioned into MMA and eventually made his way to the UFC, where he became a legitimate heavyweight contender. Hunt was never the fastest, never the most technical, but he was tough, powerful, and had a chin that seemed made of reinforced concrete. Fans loved him. He was the kind of fighter people tuned in specifically to watch. So when Mark Hunt got a fight at UFC 200, one of the biggest events in UFC history, against Brock Lesnar, it was a massive deal. Not just for Hunt, but for the sport. Now let's talk about Brock Lesnar, because his situation heading into UFC 200 was already unusual before a single punch was thrown. Brock Lesnar is one of the most recognizable names in combat sports and professional wrestling. A former UFC heavyweight champion, he left the UFC after losses to Cain Velasquez and Alistair Overeem and spent several years in WWE. By 2016, he hadn't competed in the UFC in years. Then, in June of 2016, Lesnar announced he was coming back to fight at UFC 200 on the 9th of July 2016 in Las Vegas. And here is where the first major controversy begins before the fight even happened. The UFC operates under a partnership with the United States Anti-Doping Agency, known as USADA. Under that program, fighters are required to be in USADA's testing pool for 4 months before they can compete. This is designed to establish a baseline and catch anyone who might be cycling off performance-enhancing drugs before a fight. Brock Lesnar was granted a special exemption from that 4-month testing pool requirement. Let that sink in for a moment. The standard anti-doping protocol that every other fighter had to follow was waived for Lesnar. The UFC allowed him to come back and compete without serving that standard testing window. On the 9th of July 2016, UFC 200 takes place. Lesnar defeats Mark Hunt via unanimous decision. Hunt walks away beaten. Lesnar walks away with the win. And then, 6 days later, everything changed. On the 15th of July 2016, just 6 days after the fight, USADA announced that Brock Lesnar had a potential anti-doping violation. The out-of-competition drug tests had come back. Lesnar had tested positive for 2 banned substances, clomiphene and letrozole. Now, these aren't obscure substances. Clomiphene and letrozole are both associated with hormonal manipulation. They're the kinds of compounds someone might use as part of a performance-enhancing drug cycle. Their presence is a serious violation under anti-doping rules. The announcement was an earthquake in the MMA world. A man who had just won a fight at one of the biggest UFC events in history had tested positive for banned drugs. By December of 2016, the Nevada State Athletic Commission had made its ruling. Lesnar was suspended for 1 year. He was fined $250,000. And his UFC 200 victory over Mark Hunt was overturned to a no contest. No contest, not a Hunt victory, a no contest. For Mark Hunt, that ruling raised an obvious and infuriating question. I took all of that punishment. I got hit by a man who was chemically enhanced. The fight was declared meaningless, and what exactly do I get out of this? The answer, at least initially, was very little. To understand why Hunt was so angry, and why this lawsuit had real financial stakes, you need to understand just how big UFC 200 was as an event. UFC 200 generated over 1 million pay-per-view buys. That is a massive number in the modern PPV landscape. This was a blockbuster event. The UFC made enormous money. Now look at the disclosed fighter pay as reported by the Nevada State Athletic Commission. Brock Lesnar received a disclosed purse of $2.5 million. That's what the NSAC reported as his disclosed pay, not including any potential pay-per-view points or back-end earnings. Mark Hunt received a disclosed purse of $700,000. So the situation, as Hunt saw it, was this. Lesnar came in, allegedly cheated, got paid $2.5 million, beat Hunt, had his result overturned, and faced a $250,000 fine, which is a fraction of what he earned. Hunt got beaten by a man who tested positive for banned drugs, received $700,000, and had the fight declared a no contest rather than a Hunt victory. And the man who hit him faced consequences that, financially, were arguably minor relative to his payday. Hunt was furious, and in January of 2017, he did something about it. In January 2017, Mark Hunt filed a lawsuit in the U.S. District Court of Nevada. The defendants named were the UFC, Zuffa, which is the parent company of the UFC, and Dana White personally. This was not a simple lawsuit. Hunt's legal team went big. The claims included fraud, battery, and this is the part that raised eyebrows across the legal and sports world: racketeering under the RICO Act. RICO stands for the Racketeer Influenced and Corrupt Organizations Act. It's a federal law that was originally designed to go after organized crime. Using RICO in a sports lawsuit is rare, genuinely rare. It implies a pattern of organized, coordinated criminal conduct, not just a one-time mistake or oversight. Hunt's argument, in broad terms, was this: the UFC, Zuffa, and Dana White knew or should have known that Lesnar was a doping risk. By granting him a special exemption from the standard 4-month USADA testing window and then allowing him to compete anyway, they knowingly put Hunt in the ring against a chemically enhanced fighter. Hunt argued this constituted a knowingly unfair fight that placed him in physical danger. The battery claim was particularly interesting legally. Hunt was essentially arguing that the physical contact in the fight, being punched and hit by Lesnar, constituted battery because it was done under fraudulent circumstances. If you consented to fight a clean opponent and you were actually fighting a doped one, did you really give meaningful consent to the contact? The fraud claim centered on the argument that the UFC misrepresented the fairness and legitimacy of the contest. And the RICO claim was the most aggressive, alleging a pattern of racketeering activity in how the UFC conducted its business around drug testing and fighter safety. The UFC and Dana White did not simply accept these characterizations. Their position was that they had followed all applicable rules and regulatory frameworks. Dana White, in public statements around this time, made clear that the UFC's stance was that they had complied with the processes in place. The implication was that Lesnar went through whatever testing was required of him, that USADA was the independent testing authority, and that the UFC should not be held liable for results that came through that process. From the UFC's perspective, they operated within the system. They worked with USADA. They disclosed pay to the Nevada State Athletic Commission. When the NSAC ruled on Lesnar's violation, that ruling was accepted, his win was overturned, he was suspended, he was fined. The UFC's argument was essentially, we didn't do anything wrong. We followed the rules, and the regulatory system handled the violation appropriately. The courts ultimately would have to decide who was right. The lawsuit proceeded through the federal court system over the following years, and what happened is a story of legal attrition. In February of 2019, 2 years after Hunt filed, the U.S. District Court dismissed the majority of Hunt's claims. This included the RICO claims, which the court viewed as overreaching. Federal courts have a high bar for RICO claims, and the court found insufficient evidence to support the idea that the UFC was engaged in the kind of coordinated, ongoing criminal enterprise that RICO is designed to address. The battery claim, the racketeering allegations, most of what Hunt had filed was gone by early 2019. But one claim survived: fraud. Hunt's fraud claim continued through the court process for another 2.5 years. This was the argument that the UFC had misrepresented material facts about the fight, that Hunt had been deceived about the legitimacy of the contest he was entering. Then, in September of 2021, the remaining fraud claim was also dismissed. Hunt appealed. His legal team took the case to the U.S. Court of Appeals, arguing that the lower court had gotten it wrong. In March of 2023, nearly 6 years after the lawsuit was originally filed, the U.S. Court of Appeals affirmed the dismissal of Hunt's claims. The appellate court upheld the lower court's rulings. That was it. The case was over, Every single one of Hunt's claims had been dismissed. The appeals process was exhausted. It's worth pausing here to understand why Hunt lost, because the legal outcome doesn't necessarily mean his moral argument was wrong. These are different things. On the RICO claims, courts found insufficient evidence of conspiracy or fraud to support the kind of organized criminal enterprise framing that RICO requires. This is actually a common outcome when RICO is deployed in civil cases outside of traditional organized crime contexts. The bar is high, and meeting it requires demonstrating a pattern of illegal activity, not just one incident that went badly. On the fraud claims, the court ultimately didn't find that the UFC's conduct, including the USADA exemption for Lesnar, rose to the level of actionable fraud against Hunt specifically. This is a legal conclusion, not a factual one about what happened. The courts were not saying that the USADA exemption was fine, or that Hunt's concerns about being put in with a doped fighter were unreasonable. They were saying that under the legal standards required, Hunt had not demonstrated the specific elements necessary to sustain his claims. That distinction matters. Legal systems operate on specific evidentiary standards. Moral outrage, even justified moral outrage, doesn't automatically translate into a winning lawsuit. Even though Mark Hunt lost in court, his lawsuit forced a conversation that combat sports needed to have. The USADA exemption for Lesnar was real. It happened. The UFC granted a returning fighter, one who had been away from the sport and away from the testing pool, a pass on the standard 4-month requirement. Whatever the justification for that decision, it created a situation where a fighter came back to competition without the same anti-doping scrutiny applied to everyone else. And then that fighter tested positive. Hunt's argument that this placed him in physical danger wasn't some far-fetched legal theory. He was a professional fighter. He literally stood in front of Brock Lesnar for several rounds and took damage. If Lesnar's performance was chemically enhanced, that's not an abstract concern, it has direct, physical implications for the man on the other side of the punches. The case also highlighted the financial inequities that Hunt perceived. He earned $700,000 for the fight. Lesnar earned $2.5 million. The fight was overturned to a no contest, meaning Hunt got none of the usual recognition of having beaten his opponent, because the fight was declared meaningless on paper. Lesnar's $250,000 fine was real money, but it represented a fraction of his disclosed earnings for that single night. And the PPV context makes it even sharper. UFC 200 crossed 1 million pay-per-view buys. This was a massive commercial success for the UFC. Lesnar's name was a significant part of that draw. The organization made substantial money from an event that featured a fighter who later tested positive for banned substances. Hunt looked at all of that and concluded that he had been wronged. The courts disagreed with his legal framing, but the factual outline of his grievance has never really been refuted. After the lawsuit concluded, Mark Hunt didn't disappear. He continued fighting outside of the UFC and remained one of the most outspoken voices in combat sports when it comes to performance-enhancing drugs. His criticism of the UFC and of PED use in MMA has been consistent and public for years. Hunt has never softened his position. He believes he was cheated. He believes the system failed him. And whatever you think of how the courts ruled, his position is at least coherent given the facts. He remains, even now, one of the most respected figures in the history of heavyweight striking. His K1 championship, his UFC career, his knockout power, none of that was diminished by what happened with Lesnar or by the outcome of the lawsuit. But it clearly left a mark, no pun intended. So let's bring this back to where we started. Mark Hunt fought Brock Lesnar at UFC 200 on the 9th of July 2016. He took damage. He lost a unanimous decision. 6 days later, his opponent tested positive for banned substances. The fight was overturned. The regulatory system applied its penalties. And then Hunt spent nearly 7 years fighting in the courts for additional accountability and lost every single claim. The UFC exempted Lesnar from standard testing requirements, put him in against Hunt, and when it went wrong, the legal system found no actionable fraud or racketeering. The courts sided with the UFC at every stage, from the district court in 2019 all the way through the appeals court in March of 2023. What does this case actually mean? It means that even when the facts are deeply uncomfortable, a fighter granted a testing exemption, a positive drug test, a fight declared a no contest. The legal system has specific standards for what constitutes fraud, battery, and organized criminal conduct, and Hunt's case didn't clear those bars. It also means that fighters in the UFC, and in combat sports broadly, operate in a system where the organization holds enormous structural power. The USADA partnership was supposed to clean up the sport. And in one sense, it worked. Lesnar's positive test was caught and punished. But the punishment came after the fight, after Hunt took the hits, after the money was made. Whether that is justice depends on what you think the system is supposed to protect. Mark Hunt thought it was supposed to protect him. The courts disagreed. And that's the story.